My name's Graham Morris. I'm the Member of Parliament for Easington, and I'm co-chair of the National Union of Journalists Parliamentary Group, and I'll be chairing this webinar this evening. The title of the webinar is Impunity, and it's about the safety of journalists, a very important campaign. And I'm delighted to be joining you this evening. I know attendees are still joining the meeting, but we're hoping that quite a number of NUJ members from across all sectors are going to be joining us. And I know because of the nature of the issue, members are keen to hear about precisely what resources the union's putting into this ongoing campaign calling for the safety and protection of journalists. I'll give you a bit of a rundown on what's happening. We've got the General Secretary, Michelle Stanistreet, who's going to introduce the union safety video featuring NUJ members, both in the UK and Ireland, who are going to be sharing their experience of abuse during the course of their work, simply for carrying out their work as journalists. And it's a short 8-minute video exploring the impact of racism, sexism, physical and online abuse, death threats, and more. We're going to shuffle the order a little because we've got BBC News journalist and NUJ member Monika Plaha, who features in the video, and she's going to be our first speaker. She's going to address our meeting on the on her experiences of abuse. The NUJ's long campaign for an independent investigation into the murder of NUJ member and Sunday World reporter Martin O'Hagan. Last month, the NUJ wrote to the British and Irish governments calling for their support, and Seamus Dooley, the NUJ Assistant General Secretary and Irish Secretary, will share more on the experiences of journalists in Ireland. Michelle's then going to also share details of a new journalist safety toolkit for members, and that's got information on protecting sources, lawfare, digital safety, and quite a number of other issues. It's a mobile-friendly toolkit which is easy to access on the go, providing journalists with a wealth of practical information. And Michelle's then going to introduce a short clip featuring freelance photographer Andy Aitchison, highlighting the support the NUJ provided and wider concerns on the treatment of photographers. And then we're going to have IFJ Deputy General Secretary Jeremy Deere, who's going to speak about the broader work that the IFJ is undertaking internationally with unions. He's also going to discuss the IFJ's campaign for a UN convention dedicated to the protection of journalists and media professionals. And that's against a background of ongoing threats and attacks, including those aimed at women journalists. Jim Boumelha, the NUJ National Executive Council member and also International Federation of Journalists Treasurer, will then provide an update on a complaint commission to the International Criminal Court. And this is in regard to Israel's systematic targeting of journalists, including photojournalists in Palestine. And this submission follows the death of the much respected journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in May of this year. So I'll get the ball rolling, but can I just say to the participants, if you have any points or questions for the panelists, can you please use the chat box, and we'll make a note of those and we'll put those at the end. So I'm going to invite Monika Plaha, who features in the video, to say a few words, because she's under a bit of time pressure to attend another meeting. So Monika, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Graham. Really appreciate it. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Monika Plaha, a BBC journalist, reporter and presenter. Thanks for having me on today. And around 8 years ago now, I was a NUJ scholar to study journalism at City University in London. And I think around then, you know, social media, it was new. We weren't utilizing platforms as much as we are today, therefore being targeted online for simply being a journalist. It just wasn't on my radar at all. But fast forward today, and the online abuse towards journalists is something that is so common, sadly, and it shouldn't really be happening. So just in terms of my personal experience, like, I won't touch upon everything, but I recently did a documentary. It was with BBC Panorama, and it was about explicit images of women being traded and sold and shared online without their consent. And we infiltrated this online network of anonymous users doing this, and we tracked down the perpetrator, and we really shone a light on revenge porn. I'm lucky that I work for BBC News. I have a brilliant editor and exec producers, so I had safety and security. But to be honest, I knew I was going to get targeted online, and I did. I really, really did. But it's not going to stop my journalism and me exposing wrongdoing. So I was targeted online by anonymous users calling me names, really degrading names I don't want to repeat, sending me threats, giving me abuse, making fake social media accounts of me, and then following my friends and family on it, spreading rumors, and all of this because I told a story. I reported the truth. I had one death threat with a previous story that I worked on. And as journalists, we're just trying to do our job. We're just trying to expose wrongdoing. And then that added abuse on top, it just gets tough. And it's not something that we should have to deal with. And we have thick skin, but we just don't deserve to be targeted in the most disgusting ways. And the targeted abuse, it gets relentless after a while. And I haven't had it bad like a lot of my colleagues, because I've heard some stories and it really is horrifying. One time I put out a really innocent tweet about just me getting my COVID vaccine and how I'm so grateful that I'm having the vaccine. And I never expected the amount of abuse just for one innocent tweet. It went viral, got shared across the world to the point where I was getting Instagram messages, Facebook messages, tweets from all sorts of people attacking me, saying I'm going to wake up dead the next day because I've had the vaccine, or I'm a BBC journalist promoting a killer drug, and all sorts of things are happening to me, and it's fake news targeting me and my journalism for simply having the COVID vaccine. The abuse got bad, and even people reached out to my family and friends on social media to directly message them. So even my nanny. So our personal space is invaded. Now, I am lucky that I haven't had physical threats, but inevitably we know that this does happen, and it happens quite a lot. But speaking as a female, you know, the abuse, it happens. But then speaking as someone who is also from an ethnic minority, I'm Indian, you know, it's the racism, the trolling, the disinformation. And it's something that really should not be ignored. And it's something that we shouldn't just have to accept it. We shouldn't just have to think that, right, that's it. This is my life now. I'm going to do a story and I'm going to get death threats. I recently attended a Women in Journalism event, and some of the stories that I had to listen to from women in particular, it was just awful. The death threats, the threats of rape, the threats of sexual assault. It is so terrifying. And more needs to be done. We need to create awareness, more needs to be done to tackle the issue, because journalism is not a crime, and we should not be targeted, and we shouldn't be facing this kind of abuse for simply telling the truth and exposing wrongdoing. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say, really.
Thanks very much indeed, Monika. As I say, for journalists who are logging on, NUJ members, if there are specific questions that you want to put to any of the panelists or just in the round, please use the chat box to do so. So thanks, Monika. I'm going to hand over now to Michelle, who's going to introduce the video, which I believe Monika features in, and then we'll move on to a discussion after that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Graham, and welcome to everyone who's come to the meeting. I think Monika's done a brilliant job of explaining why today and today's events and the activity that the NUJ is carrying out is so important and so much needed. We felt it was really important to bring people together to mark today. Today is the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which is a day of observance that was introduced by the UN nearly a decade ago now. And we know from the work of the IFJ and our sister unions, as well as UNESCO's own monitoring, that of the 1,200 journalists who've been killed simply for doing their job between 2006 and 2020, in over 90% of those cases, the killers went unpunished. So impunity for those crimes is an absolute scourge that touches the whole of the journalistic community globally, and one that the NUJ, together with our sister unions and the International Federation of Journalists, are very committed to stamping out. And it's great that we've got Jeremy and we've got Jim along today as well, speaking to share some of that work that is taking place, including work that the NUJ has been very directly involved in with our sister union in Palestine, and that work that the IFJ is doing to make the lives of journalists safer. And I think there's probably many of you on the call tonight who are very aware or who knew personally the NUJ freelance member Dom Phillips, who was murdered in June along with the indigenous Brazilian Bruno Pereira whilst researching a book that Dom was writing called How to Save the Amazon. And it's vital that those perpetrators are brought to justice, and that the environment for campaigners and journalists who are doing that kind of vital work in Brazil and elsewhere is transformed. But in bringing everyone together today, we wanted to make it really clear, as I think Monika's exemplified, that safety isn't just an issue in conflict zones or in regimes that are led by dictators and despots, or in places where organised crime is rife. It's a really vital, pressing issue for NUJ members, journalists who are working across the UK and Ireland, and it's something that's formed a real focus of our campaigning and policy work in recent years, and no more so than through the pandemic and right up until now, where we've seen quite a marked increase in the number of journalists who are being harassed and singled out for attack simply while doing their job. And they're incidents that are pretty diverse. We've seen repeated serious threats and harassment of journalists in Northern Ireland, mostly emanating from so-called paramilitary groups, keen not to have their criminality scrutinised, and we'll hear more from that on that from Seamus in a bit. But we've also seen over the last couple of years increasing numbers of incidents where photographers and reporters are being harangued and abused and chased, even physically attacked on the streets whilst they're out and about covering events and demos and protests. We've had a photographer member whose home was graffitied and accused of being a spy for the state. Whatever the nature of the gathering or the type of protest they might be, a common thread has been demonstrators not wanting their behaviour or their faces to be captured on film. We've seen cases of far-right activists issuing death threats to journalists on social media and to their homes, putting their addresses and personal information on them and their families out into the public domain. And our research and the government's shows that women and Black and minority ethnic journalists are especially targeted. We've seen women reporters being targeted with threats of rape and sexual violence, threats to be set on fire, to have their throats slit, disgusting stuff that they've had to contend with, threats that have even extended of a similar violent, sexualised nature to their young kids and babies. It's something that local newspaper reporters are experiencing, as well as those with higher profiles nationally on TV or radio. And it's behaviour that's designed to silence. Whilst a lot of that happens online, it's also spilling out into real life stalking and harassment. And it's forming constant pressure that our members are having to work within. And it's that kind of from the low level relentlessness of the abuse that many women journalists in particular face all the time, to the most odious of threats that journalists then have to worry about, you know, how seriously they should take them. Is it just somebody kicking off on social media, or is it a serious threat? It's a very stressful thing to have to constantly deal with. And many of our members have spoken to us about the pernicious impact it has on their work, how it can, make you check yourself before you post. Is it worth me saying anything on this? How it even self-censors what you report on and what you write about. And most of the male reporters we've spoken to in the course of work we've done also say that no matter how much abuse their own work might garner, it's never on the same scale as many of their female colleagues. And there's another example I wanted to draw on before we move into watching the short film, is an example of a completely different arm's length way of harassing journalists here in the UK, which has been by weaponising their families abroad. And we've campaigned for many years about the harassment of journalists at the BBC Persian service and our members working at Iran International. And those examples have really stepped up with very frequent harassment and intimidation of their relatives in Iran over the last months and years, with their relatives being hauled in for questioning, held in solitary confinement, passports confiscated, threatened, told to force their relatives here in London to quit their job as a journalist and to return to Iran. We've had threats made of snatch squads being sent to London to seize journalists off the street. And I just want to say what big support the IFJ have been in that work, which has such an immediate and personal impact on our members here in London, helping us to raise the abuse by Iran as a state at the UN, and its work that we'll continue to push and prioritise. And you see a common thread in all of it is seeing or depicting journalists as the enemy, as spies, as arms of the state. So it also links into that work that we do about the importance of journalistic material, the protection of sources. So it's when it comes to questions of safety, it's vital that interactions between police, the authorities and journalists are very important. For example, not using photographers and videographers as shortcuts in police investigations by issuing sweeping production orders and attempting to seize journalistic material. People need to be able to trust in the impartiality of journalists and their ability to protect confidentiality of sources. So it'll be great when we see Andy's clip a bit later on. We've been doing loads of work on this, our surveys, our work on the government's National Committee for the Safety of Journalists, and we'll come on to some of those practical things later in the meeting. But a lot of it boils down to changing the culture that journalists work in, as well as improving support from employers, getting police to better tackle complaints and prosecutorial services to clamp down more robustly on perpetrators. We've heard so much about how journalists feel they've had to suck it up, that this abuse is just part of the job, that if they're feeling the pressure or buckling under the strain, then it's somehow their fault, not least because the reality of much of this abuse is at such a level and frequency that it's become normalised. So our message as the union is very clear. It's not normal. This shouldn't be part of anyone's job. And collectively, we need to ensure that such harassment and abuse is stamped out and not tolerated. And that's where this short film that we're about to share with you comes in. We've launched this week. Thanks so much to Monika and all the other journalists who were willing to speak out. A lot of people felt very inhibited from even speaking out in public on this because of any further repercussions. But it's really important that you all on this meeting call can hear directly about how this kind of behaviour impacts on journalists and on their work, and why together we need to put an end to it. We're very proud of it. I think it's very impactful, and I hope you feel the same. So if we can start that video now.
All of my colleagues have similar experiences. It's not just me.
Even in the UK, it's relatively unheard of that journalists end up in hospital, but that's happened on quite a few occasions in the last few years.
My colleague of mine obviously was shot dead, so you always have that in the back of your mind.
This person attacked me without having any knowledge of who I was as a person.
Nothing can really prepare you for comments like that.
You talk about racism or race and immediately get this massive backlash. Who do you think you are? What the hell are you doing here?
It has taken over my life and my children, my husband. So it is very difficult, and there are many moments that I think to myself, I hope it's worth it.
I think it's getting to the stage now where if we're doing lives in public after dark, where I would always err towards caution and ask for at least a producer to be with me or even a security person to be there just to watch my back. But it's just such a pity that 10 years ago we wouldn't have to think about this at all.
I was getting ready to go to air. I had my earpiece in. I could hear that we were on the weather, which meant that I would be the next story coming up for the top story for the regional news. And a gentleman walks past and asks what I'm doing. He's like, "Who do you work for?" I said, "We work for the BBC." And he got his drink, cup of hot chocolate, and threw it all over me.
During the middle of the pandemic, we were being spat at and things like that. People were being physically attacked. It's things like that that really do throw you and think, you know, how bad have things actually got?
The majority of Iranian journalists who are working outside Iran have accepted the fact that at some point they personally might be harassed or their family members inside the country might get into trouble. Earlier in 2020, I had a nervous breakdown and I couldn't go to work for 2 months, and I had to see therapists to deal with the PTSD. My father had been interrogated by the agents of the intelligence ministry. He was told that he should stop me from working for the BBC. His passport was confiscated. My mother's passport was confiscated, and they were under a travel ban for a year. On personal level, I've been receiving death threats, and not just against myself, but against my family members as well.
3:30 in the morning, I could hear this banging on the door. It was the police who had come to tell me that I was an imminent threat. For a couple of weeks, you find yourself, you know, before you do the school run, you jump in, don't jump in the car yet, kids, just wait till daddy checks, goes like, "That's okay, way you go, it's all right." Once you've had a few, you kind of think, "Oh, there's probably nothing, it's probably just somebody trying to scare me." But just after I'd started at the Sunday World, you know, Martin O'Hagan was murdered. So you always have that in the back of your mind. You just never know for sure, you can't be certain.
BBC News, fake news, BBC News, fake news, with me tagged into it. And then it's got a picture of me with awful language.
As soon as you hit send or publish on a story, sometimes you feel a little bit like you're walking into an online gladiatorial arena, because the reception you can get is really quite hideous.
The level of discussion sort of rapidly sort of descends into sort of nastiness.
That person's hair, that person's outfit, the way that person speaks. It's not just about their journalism.
Every time I go on holiday, actually, they can see that I'm away or I'm having a good time. I tend to receive an influx of hate from Instagram accounts. A lot of these accounts, a lot of these troll accounts tend to do it when you are on holiday, when you are having fun. They want to take the excitement and happiness away. I remember when I first started being on air and someone questioned, once again, where I'm from, because I don't sound like I'm from this country.
It's clear there's a massive underrepresentation of ethnic minority journalists in the British media. You know, there are 8% minorities, but that figure doesn't tell the whole story, because those people will absolutely overwhelmingly be at the very junior levels of the British press. The Guardian carried out an analysis of below-the-line comments that 6 of the top 10 most abused writers were people of colour.
Whenever it's comments to do with the colour of your skin, it's not nice. It's really hurtful.
I think if you belong to a minority group or you're reporting on issues that affect minority groups, that can make one more susceptible, more vulnerable to receiving abuse and types of hate speech, especially online. And we've seen that time and time again.
I've no doubt that me being a woman elicits a higher level of abuse than I see targeted at male court reporters.
Members of the public will leap into shot, particularly with female reporters.
So, you know, heckling, whether it's being chased after, called all sorts of words.
They posted a photo of my husband on a state news organization, and then the state television showed those as well, and they claimed that I'm not married to my husband. And again, that's a way to discredit our journalism by saying that, oh, these are corrupt women who are interested in Western liberal values and they're attacking our religious values. So being a woman means that you experience things that your male colleagues won't necessarily experience.
It really puts you off putting stuff online at all. So it actually has a chilling effect on the reporting that you do. Sometimes it stops you from going along to court because you feel like this case, for example, rape cases, I know exactly how this is going to go on Facebook. I know exactly what people are going to say about me. I would always, 10, 11 years ago, cover a full rape trial from beginning to end, in fact, from charge to end. Now, when somebody's charged with rape, unless they're a public figure, we don't tend to cover charging decisions, nor do we tend to cover the beginnings of rape trials, because people on social media have an opinion that we should not be naming defendants in rape cases. Now, if we're not covering rape trials, how can we ever see the process by which a jury returns a guilty verdict? How can we scrutinise our courtrooms? We can't, because we don't know why a jury's reached that verdict unless we're there reporting it. So you end up, in effect, with all these sex attacks, usually on women, crimes against women, not being properly covered by the regional press, and that is an absolute travesty.
The way I look at it is anybody working in any other job in any other sector of the world, would you accept this sort of behaviour? No. So why would it be acceptable in this job?
Journalists probably don't report sort of abuse or threats they might receive on a daily basis necessarily, because it is just expected. And when I say that out loud, I think that seems really, really sad, actually.
Somebody comes up to you and shouts in your face, or spits at you, or threatens you, then something needs to be done to stop that.
Having NUJ's support means that we don't feel alone. It feels like we see this job and everybody who's involved with it as an entity. We are in this together, and any sort of attack on one journalist, regardless of their nationality and which country they come from, is an attack on all of us. And it means that we will take stands together against what's happening.
Thanks so much for that. It's a very, very powerful testimony from NUJ members all across the piece, indicating the level of threat and intimidation they're subjected to every day in the course of carrying out their duties. I'm going to go over now to Seamus Dooley, who's the NUJ Irish Secretary, and Seamus is going to give us an insight into the harsh realities faced by journalists in Ireland, and in particular with reference to the NUJ's Martin O'Hagan investigation and the calls for justice for Martin and his family. Seamus?
Thank you very much, Graham. There is an inevitability about my contributions to this webinar, and on every occasion when we speak about impunity for crimes against journalists, my role as Assistant General Secretary tends to be to point to police failings in relation to the murder of Martin O'Hagan. And while that may seem predictable, until we get action on Martin O'Hagan, we will never stop talking about Martin O'Hagan. But the murder of Martin O'Hagan is not some sort of historic event. And this is evident from Stephen Moore's contribution from those other videos. the impunity enjoyed by those who murdered Martin O'Hagan has given a freedom to other people and a license for other people to behave badly. And we continue as a union to protect journalists. Much of the threats are on social media, and many of them are clearly gendered and against women journalists in particular, in Northern Ireland and indeed in Southern Ireland. So the lessons of Martin O'Hagan, one of the lessons is you can get away with it. You can literally get away with murder. It's not that there are not other threats to journalists, but the unsolved murder of Martin casts a long and, I would say, sinister shadow. It's sort of salutary and a reminder of the march of time that there are probably people, younger journalists on this call, who were just about born when Martin O'Hagan was murdered. He was killed on the 28th of September 2001 while walking home from a pub with his wife, Mary. Mary died last April, and we remember her tonight. And our thoughts on an occasion like this are with Martina, with Cara and Niamh, and with Chloe, Connor, Owen and Katie, the grandchildren whom Martin never got to meet. And that also is a stark reminder that behind the stories, the figures, the statistics that Michelle quoted earlier, there are families and real people. And we must never forget that. In December 2006, Martina, Cara and Niamh wept at the inquest into Martin's death as Mary very vividly relived the final minutes of his life. And it's worth rewinding to that inquest, where the coroner, John Leckie, said that he was satisfied with the police theory that the murder of Martin O'Hagan was related to investigative journalism in relation to drug dealing by the Loyalist Volunteer Force in the Mid-Ulster area. At the same inquest, a PSNI inspector stated that he was confident that the investigation team knew who killed Martin O'Hagan, but was unable to uncover sufficient evidence to secure convictions. That represented a clear admission of failure to deal with one of the most significant unsolved murders in the history of Northern Ireland, and those failures remain. Chief Inspector Charles Patterson, who I subsequently met, said the murder inquiry remained alive, but was not being actively worked on. Alive, but not actively being worked on. However, he promised the case would be internally reviewed by the PSNI in the new year, and the O'Hagan family would be informed. On the occasion of Martin's anniversary, this September, I wrote to the then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, remember him, and to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. I wrote on the 27th of September, and I received a reply from Chris Heaton Harris on the 24th of October, 2 Prime Ministers later. He confirmed that the case, quote, remains within the caseload of the Legacy Investigation Branch, and he had been assured that when the review is due to begin, the PSNI will contact the family to discuss the review process and address any concerns the family may have. That assurance is strikingly similar to the PSNI statement at the inquest 16 years earlier. And I just read that again. Chief Inspector Patterson said the case would be internally reviewed by the PSNI in the new year, and the O'Hagan family would be informed. So there is this bureaucratic language, this template which is dusted down and provided to the NUJ, to the IFJ, and I'm sure that we are not alone in the way in our frustration at bureaucratic letters like that. With the passage of time, I have been strengthened in my conviction that only an independent international inquiry can be trusted to investigate the murder of Martin O'Hagan. That reply from the Secretary of State confirms that the Northern Ireland office is simply not listening, and our suggestion of an independent investigation is not even being answered. It's not even referenced in the letter because it wasn't contained in the original template. Martin O'Hagan was, like many of the journalists who we are thinking about today, killed because he knew too much. The belief that those who killed him were in collusion with the security forces at one time seemed far-fetched. I'm afraid that's no longer the case. And my firm belief now is that they are being protected because they knew and they know too much. And that's why we have been advocating an international investigation into Martin's death. Martin O'Hagan's death is just one death. It is in many ways the story of all of those journalists who have been killed and for whom justice has been denied, not just to them and to their families. We in the NUJ are working much closer now with the police, north and south. We have put in place measures for the protection of our members, for early reporting systems. But as long as those who killed Martin O'Hagan go unpunished, as long as this remains a cold case in a very large deep freeze with so many other cases, we will not rest. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Seamus. Thanks for that insight. I know it's an issue, an injustice that burns with the NUJ and with the whole of the trade union movement. And I thank you for highlighting that and reminding us of the circumstances. I'm going to go on now to invite Jeremy Deere from the International Federation of Journalists, the Deputy General Secretary, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the international landscape and safety work, and perhaps make reference to some of the terrible atrocities that have happened across the globe. We've heard about Iran and in Israel, but Jeremy's going to tell us something about the UN Convention on the Safety and Security of Journalists. So Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks to Michelle and the NUJ for the invitation to join you this evening. And let me start by congratulating the NUJ and all those members brave enough to speak out for that video, which I think is really powerful. And the work that the union is doing on the safety of journalists has been excellent. And of course, it is crucial. You've brilliantly documented and exposed the growing threats to journalists in the UK and Ireland. And it is a pattern of targeting and intimidation that we see around the world. And so as diplomats, governments and lawyers gather in Vienna tomorrow to mark the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists, it's important that we use opportunities like this to ensure the voice of working journalists, too often absent from such high-level conferences, is heard loud and clear, because that conference meets against a backdrop of increased killings, growing threats and attacks, the widespread abuse of laws to jail journalists and silence media, a pandemic of online harassment and intimidation, which, as Monika said, seeks to silence independent media. Just this week, for example, a Channel 5 journalist in Pakistan was killed. Police in Haiti shot dead a journalist who was demanding freedom for a jailed colleague. Our union in Yemen reminds the world that 4 journalists remain on death row. It comes a week after 11 journalists were jailed in Turkey, a journalist shot dead by security forces in Chad. And so despite 10 years of the UN Plan of Action, almost 9 in 10 killings remain unresolved. In some countries, impunity is at 100%, with barely a cursory attempt to find the killers. The killings of women journalists have doubled in the past 2 years alone. And contrary to the situation when the UN Plan of Action was first launched, today, of the almost 120 journalists killed in 2020 to 2021, 78% of those were killed in their vehicle, at home or in the street. not victims of war, but victims of organised crime and deliberate targeting. And as Seamus, Michelle and Monica made clear, it's not just in those faraway towns and cities that such threats and impunity undermines media freedom. So today on International Day to End Impunity, we should be clear: impunity must stop. It silences media voices, it breeds self-censorship, and it emboldens those who attack journalists with no consequence for themselves. And so it is that lack of action which prompted the IFJ to launch the campaign for an international convention on the safety and independence of journalists to be adopted by the UN. The assumption that underpinned the original UN plan of action was that international law already has sufficient and relevant safeguards for journalists' rights, and that all the efforts should focus on implementation. But we have highlighted important weaknesses in the existing international legal regime. There are no binding treaty norms that establish safeguards for media workers. There's no precise set of obligations as regards journalists, which overlooks the risks associated with journalistic free speech. The right of the public to receive information is recognized, but completely unenforceable. Our convention would, for the first time, establish binding norms creating safeguards for media workers specifically, recognizing both the greater risks that journalists face when compared to other civilians, the strategic advantage to be gained from the targeting of journalists, and the systemic effect of attacks against journalists on society's right to information. It confers a binding value to widely accepted but unenforceable so-called soft law standards, not new norms, but norms that lack legal force. It thereby fosters greater accountability. The convention envisages a dedicated enforcement mechanism, a committee for the safety of journalists, a body of independent jurists who do not represent national interests nor take instructions from governments, modelled after successful UN precedents, the Committee Against Torture, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and so on. Now, some in the international community say that efforts should be focused on implementation of current norms, but implementation requires binding legal obligations and enforcement avenues. The current legal framework is weak in this respect, and we believe a dedicated instrument would address these weaknesses. But of course, we cannot rely solely on a UN convention, which is why the IFJ is also involved in a range of other actions, including taking a case to the International Criminal Court to seek accountability for the deliberate and systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists by the Israeli authorities, which Jim will talk about in a minute. Actively working with others to build and make effective the national safety mechanisms in countries across the world. Providing legal support through our partnership with UNESCO for journalists in Africa and Asia, enforcing wherever we can employers' duty of care to protect their journalists, and international advocacy and campaigns from the UN Human Rights Council, specifically around the attacks on BBC Persian and Iran International that Michelle mentioned, right down to the streets of Bogota or Gaza or Kabul, where campaigns are supported and run. Today, UNESCO issued a statement that says impunity for crimes against journalists affects the core of our freedoms of expression and information. Silencing a journalist has consequences for everyone. We cannot turn a blind eye to impunity. We cannot let their deaths be invisible to society. We agree, and that's why we believe it is time for a new UN convention and a new political will to tackle impunity. Our job alongside the NUJ and alongside unions across the world is to raise our voices and create the political will. And we look forward to continuing the work with the NUJ to do that in the UK, in Ireland, and across the world.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeremy. That's really useful, and congratulations on the work that you're doing on behalf of journalists all over the world, and particularly in relation to what's happening here in the UK and Ireland. I wonder if I might ask Michelle Stanistreet, the NUJ General Secretary, to tell us a little bit about the Journalist Safety Toolkit and the Press Freedom Tracker. It might be instructive at this point if we know a little bit more about that. And without preempting the questions that are being put in by members, it is one of the issues that's been raised. So I'm sorry if I overlooked that earlier. Michelle, could you give us some information about that, please?
Yeah, sure, Graham. I mean, it's one of the actions adopted by the government's National Committee for the Safety of Journalists that we've led on, along with the Society of Editors, is that very practical one of the creation of an online journalist safety toolkit. We've launched that this week. I think we're going to put up an image of that on the screen for you. Basically, it's a mini app, a progressive web app that's designed to be accessible and able to be downloaded and sit on your mobile phone or a tablet in the same way as any other normal app would. There's lots of information and resources at hand in that to equip journalists with the tools to hopefully do their job more safely and for our reps to be able to use in their workplaces. It's a resource we're going to be updating frequently, and we hope it'll be really useful for people. So please do download it from our web link so that you've got that to hand as an app on your phone. It also sits alongside another suite of material we published about a year ago now, the Story Smart suite of training modules and material that's aimed at reporters and photographers working in hostile environments amidst hazardous tech. So it's very much aimed at keeping our members, their sources and their journalistic materials safe. And I've also been having interesting dialogue with colleagues in the States about the press freedom tracker that exists there and has done for quite some time now, and with other colleagues in Canada who've been developing their own version to launch this year. And I think after all this work that we've been doing, an online database that could log and track incidents of harassment and abuse and any trends that we can see happening would be a really valuable tool going forward and potentially much more effective than retrospective surveys. So that's something I've raised on the government's safety committee, and if it's something that that committee is not prepared to get behind and do, then it's something that I'll certainly be exploring how the NUJ could launch its own press freedom tracker that also does focus on harassment that happens online as well as in other ways. And sometimes, as I said earlier, the challenges and the interference in our members' work comes from the authorities themselves. So we've also stepped up those efforts to improve education and awareness amongst police about the vital work our members do and the respect that they should show for our members at work in those challenging circumstances. And as an example of why that's important, we've got a very short video clip from freelance photographer Andy Aitchison, as you mentioned before, about his experiences. So if we can just watch that before we move on to Jim, that would be great.
My daughter came into my office to say that there was police arriving at our door. I was photographing at Napier Barracks in Folkestone, and I was arrested later that day for photographing a protest that happened there, and I spent 8 hours in police custody for photographing. Any photographer, journalist, media camera person should not fear arrest for doing their job. It's not something that should be even considered. You know, if you're committing a crime, then yes, you should fear arrest, but you should not fear arrest for doing your job. Getting the apology from the police in the end was extremely satisfying. You know, I just felt like the truth had come out. You know, I knew all along that I shouldn't have been arrested. I've always been an NUJ member, and I don't have that much to do with it on day-to-day basis, but whenever I've needed the NUJ, they've come into their own. Their support, both emotionally and legally, was incredible, basically. I had no idea that sort of process just kicks in, and you know, they put me together with one of the best solicitors firms in the country for dealing with this sort of claim, and they did an incredible job. And I'll always be thankful to the NUJ for that help.
Great, thanks. That's really useful, Michelle. Thanks very much. It's kind of put it into context that there are things that NUJ members can do, and excellent that Andy Aitchison, who featured in that little clip, was so effusive in his praise for the support he'd had from the union in those very difficult circumstances. So that's really useful information for members. I'm going to go on now to Jim Boumelha, who's NUJ Policy Committee member and also the International Federation of Journalists Treasurer, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the complaint that's been submitted to the ICC, and that's over something that's concerned many of us, the systematic targeting of journalists and photojournalists, particularly Palestinian journalists in the occupied territories. So Jim, over to you. Jim, you might be muted. Can you press unmute?
Right, there you go. Thank you very much, Graham, and many thanks to the NUJ and to Michelle for making space for impunity in Palestine to also be a theme of this webinar. This is not the first time that the NUJ is discussing the fate of journalists in Palestine killed while doing their jobs, and those who are attacked almost every day by Israeli forces. And we in the IFJ have been engaged in supporting Palestinian journalists from the first day they joined our federation 40 years ago. And we have a massive knowledge of what has been happening to them almost on a daily basis. Their murders and hundreds of attacks by Israeli forces are well documented. I can spend hours trawling through the statistics provided every quarter by our sister union, the Palestine Journalist Syndicate. And just to give you a glimpse of the sheer volume of what they endure, the latest figures for the second half of 2022 listed some 470 violations, ranging from detention and prevention of coverage to arrests and targeting with bullets, and this in addition to travel bans, court summonses, physical assaults, smashing of equipment, and other violations. And every of these cases, the soldier or police officer or border guard who pulled the trigger, their superiors who gave the orders, the politician who make the excuses, they all managed to get off scot-free. This means that it's almost virtually risk-free for an Israeli soldier to kill a journalist in Palestine. It was finally the ruling by the judges at the pre-trial chamber at the ICC, the International Court, that Palestine is a state party to the Rome Statute, which opened the door for us and for the PGS. In February 2021, judges at the ICC pre-trial chambers decided by a majority that the court may exercise its criminal jurisdiction in the situation in Palestine, and that the territorial scope of this jurisdiction extend to Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We could have easily submitted scores of complaints, but we have chosen to make two communications. In the first one, in April 2022, we submitted complaints in the case of 4 Palestinian journalists, Mu'ad Amarneh, Nida Lishtaya, who were shot and injured, and Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Mutara, who were shot dead during the March of Great Return in Gaza in 2018. We made the submission on behalf of their families. And we submitted the complaints as well as dozens of solid testimonies. One of the most compelling evidence was published in February 2019 in the Human Rights Council Independent Commission of Inquiry report on the protests in the occupied Palestinian territory, which documented that between 30th of March and 31st of December 2018 alone, 2 journalists were killed and 39 journalists injured by live ammunition used by the Israeli forces, 5 journalists injured by a bullet fragment or shrapnels, and 4 journalists injured by rubber-coated metal bullets, and finally, 32 journalists injured by direct tear gas canister hit. And in the cases investigated, the journalists were wearing vests and or helmets, clearly marked press. And the commission found reasonable ground to believe that Israeli snipers shot journalists intentionally, despite seeing that they were clearly marked as such, and concluded that the Israeli security forces shot journalists who had not lost their protected status, and Israel is thus in violation of international humanitarian law. The second part of this communication concerned the bombing in May 2021 of 2 towers in Gaza, housing Palestinian and international media organizations, as well as civilian families and other businesses. And although there were no casualties, Palestinian media organizations and journalists lost valuable equipment, hampering their ability to continue working. On this one, the Commission of Inquiry also commented that the buildings were civilian objects. There were reasonable grounds to conclude that the attacks against this building were conducted in violation of the prohibition of attacks against civilian objects and the humanitarian laws. Our second communication to the ICC was made only a few weeks ago on the 20th of September, following the shooting and killing of Shireen Abu Akleh on May the 11th by Israeli soldiers, and the wounding of her colleague Ali Samoudi in the same attack. We also included in the complaint Shata Hanaisha, who was close by but miraculously escaped injury. They were all wearing helmets and protective vests marked press at the time of the shooting. And since this tragic day, we have and will continue to gather testimonies, and we emphasize in our submission that the 11th of May shooting should not be treated as an isolated incident. It was emblematic of the systemic and lawful and lethal targeting of journalists in Palestine by the Israeli authorities and the ongoing impunity enjoyed by those responsible. In conclusion, in both communications, we requested the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to initiate an investigation pursuant to Article 53 of the Rome Statute, arguing that 1, there are reasonable grounds to suspect that crimes within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed. 2, that the cases are admissible under Article 17 of the Rome Statute. And 3, in the light of the gravity and widespread nature of this crime, the concern that journalists have been targeted and continue to be targeted as a matter of state policy, the ongoing impunity enjoyed by those responsible, and the interest of the victims of these crimes who have been denied any form of redress or reparation in the investigation and prosecution of this crime, that there are substantial reason to believe that an investigation will serve the interests of justice. This is what we are today. We're well aware of the many mountains we still have to climb. And despite claims by the ICC of its independence and impartiality, we know full well that it can be caught in geopolitics. We've seen, for example, how quickly it poured huge resources in opening an immediate investigation regarding alleged crimes committed in Ukraine. And for the moment, we don't know how they will respond to our complaints and when they will respond. But we are not going to sit on our hands and wait. We have already started laying the ground for a global campaign directed at the ICC that they must open an investigation, something we hope the NUJ, its chapels, branches, and members will join us to help achieve. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jim. I mean, that's an incredible update. And for there to be over 470 violations in the second half of last year is an incredible number. And it's the most appalling targeting of journalists going about their lawful duty, not in a one-off way. It's a systematic, as you say, unlawful and lethal targeting. And the fact that those responsible seem to enjoy impunity from any accountability for their actions. I mean, I wish you every success in pursuing that case with the ICC. So thanks ever so much for your contribution, Jim. It is appreciated. And I'm sure the members in the branches value very much what you're doing. It's important work, not just for those journalists and photojournalists in the occupied territories, but across the world, if we can secure that court case and conviction. So thanks ever so much for that. in the schedule, we've got a question and answer session. And I did ask at the outset that if members participating could put their questions in the chat box, and the one that I can see initially, I'm not going to identify who it is, but both Monika and Michelle referred to the online toolkit, and in fact we had a little explanation of what it was. I don't know whether Michelle's explanation was sufficient, but members are asking what help is available regarding online threats and how available is the app. So Michelle, I wonder if you might respond to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the app's now launched, and everybody's now got the link in the chat box as well. So I'd encourage people to have a look and explore it, see the information and the guidance and the resources and signposting to other sites and resources as well. That's there. And please, pass on any feedback through to us, to our campaigns team. We're all also working really closely alongside all of that with lots of employers through our rep structures in workplaces and media outlets throughout the UK and in Ireland, to get those employers to kind of up their game when it comes to offering support and different ways in which that they can assist their own staff. I have to say, a lot of employers have been pretty bad in this regard, and all the time in those conversations we're at pains to ensure that they're not just thinking about their employees, but they're thinking about their freelance contributors as well. Freelancers often get cast adrift in that sense. I noticed in the chat box, Simone from a Culture of Safety Alliance, flags the free training, the hazardous environment training that's on offer from them for freelancers, and that's incredibly important. I think that wider industry support for freelancers who often training and different things that are available are prohibitively expensive. So if people have a look and explore that and come back to us, that's definitely going to be something, Graham, that we'll be building on and adding to, as well as pointing to good practice in different workplaces and from particular publishers and employers.
Thanks, and thanks for responding to that point about the ACOS Alliance. And there was also suggestion about, particularly for freelancers, that might be a good organisation to seek a speaker for at a future webinar. Michelle, on the social media, on the NUJ Twitter account, will there be a link to the app, that the members can readily access?
Yeah, absolutely. I have no doubt that Bea and Francis are on the case, and that's being shared as we speak.
Okay. I don't know if there's anything else that other panel members wish to pick up on, either in the contributions or in the Q&A in the chat. Is there anything further? I can't see anyone indicating. Is there anything else that you want to pick up with in summation, Michelle? Or otherwise, I'm proposing to wrap up. In fact, there's two chats going at the same time. There's the webinar chat and there's the Q&A one. I think I might.
I think so. Liam's also come in. So if people just kind of look back a few posts on the chat, there's right. The information about that free training and how to access that. And I'm sure we'll distribute that amongst our freelance members as well, out with this meeting. I think, Graham, just there's one, Natasha Hurst asks, what more can we do to put pressure on UK and the devolved governments to challenge the negative rhetoric of the press? And I think it's an important issue, and we've dealt with that sometimes at the parliamentary group meetings as well, haven't we, Graham? And in evidence sessions that we've given to select committees in Parliament, and I certainly have raised on the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists 2 ministers who take part in that. It's co-chaired by DCMS and by the Home Office, that actually, it's one thing having a government approach on the safety of journalists, and then in the same breath, you've got ministers and people in positions of influence that are slagging off journalists in the media and casting doubt on their work, and, the hackneyed use of fake news to describe news that they don't agree with. And I think that whole kind of political standards of political discourse and how, you know, the media and journalists have spoken about is incredibly important, because, you know, that can be part of the problem when it comes to, you know, those issues of trust and the abuse and harassment, you know, that has become pretty endemic. So I think we need to do more of that, and it's something as a union we try and call that out where we see it and highlight, and it's also there in some of the work that we've been doing on media literacy and trying to kind of embed some of our work in media literacy strategies, you know, in devolved government and through central government. So that's very much work in progress, I'd describe that.
Okay, thanks.
Graham, I might come in on that as well.
Yeah.
Would be happy if we did have a devolved government in Northern Ireland for a start, but I think there was an interesting example, very shocking example of what Michelle is referring to at the DUP conference recently, where Amanda Ferguson, one of the leading freelance journalists in Northern Ireland and a prominent NUJ member, found herself in the position to be refused access to the DUP conference because they didn't like her attitude to abortion and to her participation as a professional journalist in a conference that they disagreed with. And it was a tribute to other NUJ members working for other media organisations that when they refused to allow Amanda to attend, that other media organisations said, well, if you don't have Amanda Ferguson, you don't have us either. And they were forced to climb down. But, you know, in Northern Ireland, this is a very real problem, and it's not just a problem faced by journalists. Currently, the academic Colin Harvey from Queen's University has found himself at the end of a vicious campaign because certain people don't like his academic research, and therefore have been highly critical of his work. And there have been actually threats. He's now under receipt of police protection, PSNI protection, for the expression of academic views. And I think we'll be wrong here today, even though we are talking about journalists, to not to mention that in the context of that freedom of expression is a vital component of the protection of human rights. But I do think that we need to remind ourselves as well that the tech giants cannot get away forever with simply saying we only provide the platform, and that they have no responsibility, no matter how vile, no matter how vicious, no matter how homophobic or misogynistic. And that is one of the real challenges for us as well. And the notion of some sort of false narrative that this is the protection of freedom of expression is frankly bullshit. And I think we have to call out freedom of expression for what it is. It is not a license to hate.
Yeah. Thanks, Seamus. I don't know if anyone has spotted there's a question in the webinar chat rather than the Q&A chat, and it's about the issue that Andy Aitchison raised in the video, you know, about restrictions and the effects of the National Security Bill. And an NUJ member called Duncan Campbell has pointed out that, you know, this issue about lawful arrest because the site could be a prohibited place. And I don't know if this applies to the, you know, to the detention centre in Manson as well. But it says because the Home Secretary's got powers to declare a prohibited place under new laws, and he says that the London freelance branch are going to be speaking a bit more about that and the implications for members at their meeting on the 14th of November. He's actually asking if Andy might be available to participate in that. But if Andy's on the call, I can't see everyone who's on it. There's quite a lot of people. Then perhaps he might respond directly to Duncan Campbell, or if Michelle or someone could pick that up.
I think Bea and Francis have said they'll put them in touch. So
excellent.
No worries. The Duncans can be put in touch with Andy after the meeting. We'll make sure that happens. Terrific.
And there are a couple of people who want to take up issues directly with Jeremy as well. I think it must be international issues. So if there isn't anything further, and if you're content, I'm proposing to wrap things up. I think it's been a really interesting, useful and informative webinar, and I can't wait to see the the toolkit distributed and the feedback from members. I think it's a really positive thing the NUJ are doing. I might just say, you mentioned about politicians. I'm not, we had a terrific meeting about 2 weeks ago with the BBC World Service staff and BBC Local Radio, and arising from the work that NUJ members did, both at the meeting, there's about 100 there, and then subsequently lobbying MPs in the bars and so on. We had a terrific statement, and so many MPs across party were praising the local radio journalists for the value of the service and so on. So it does work, that the efforts that the NUJ are making directly in Parliament and through the parliamentary group, it does have an impact. So please don't give up. Let's keep on the fight on these issues that we know are right. And thanks ever so much for tuning in and for listening to this webinar this evening. So I'm going to bid you good night, and thanks very much indeed.